The room was silent, save for the faint hum of radios and the soft shuffle of papers. A single lamp cast harsh shadows across the walls, exaggerating the sharp angles of maps pinned up like battle scars. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt leaned over the desk, eyes scanning the intelligence report in his hands. Each line he read seemed to burn into his mind. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath, voice tight with disbelief. His fingers clenched the edge of the table as if holding on to the room itself could anchor him against the storm of news. The Ploiești oil fields, Romania's lifeblood, Germany's fuel supply, had been obliterated. Allied bombers had struck with surgical precision, and the refineries were in ruins. Half of Germany's fuel production had vanished overnight. Rundstedt's mind raced. Tanks idling in mud, aircraft grounded on distant airstrips, supply convoys stranded across frozen roads. The Wehrmacht's vast mechanized armies, once a symbol of unstoppable power, now faced paralysis. He could see it all in his mind's eye. Columns of panzer divisions halted miles from the front, trucks abandoned with engines cold, pilots staring at the sky they could no longer conquer. He looked up, staring at the other officers in the room. They spoke in hushed tones, debating repair schedules, rationing, contingencies, but Rundstedt heard only the echo of inevitability. Do they not understand? He thought. Without fuel, we are no longer the hunters, we are the hunted. The door creaked open and a junior officer stepped in, carrying another folder. Rundstedt barely glanced at it. The numbers, the maps, the analysis all pointed to the same truth. Germany's war machine was fractured. The Allies had struck a blow not just at a refinery, but at the very heart of the Third Reich's ability to fight. For a moment, Rundstedt allowed himself a rare vulnerability. He closed his eyes and pictured the front lines, the soldiers' faces, the cities depending on victory. And then he felt it, a chill creeping into his bones, the undeniable, sinking realization that this single loss could tilt the scales irreversibly. Victory, he thought grimly, was no longer an option. Not without fuel, not without mobility, not without hope. He reopened his eyes, staring at the map of Europe with renewed intensity. Each line of front, each symbol of conquest, now seemed fragile, temporary. The war that had promised glory and dominance now threatened collapse. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like never before. And in that quiet, tension-filled office, amidst the shuffle of papers and the distant drone of engines, Rundstedt understood a terrifying truth. Germany's momentum had ended the moment Ploiești burned. Outside, the night remained still, unaware of the disaster that had just struck. Inside, a man who had commanded armies felt the unshakable tremor of impending defeat. The shadow of fuel scarcity stretched across every battlefield, every front, every life. And for the first time, Rundstedt did not see victory at the horizon. He saw only a war slipping away, faster than he could grasp, faster than he could stop. The echo of the Ploiești disaster reverberated across every German command post, but no one felt it more keenly than Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Reports streamed in from the Eastern Front, from France, from Italy. Every theater of operations seemed to carry the same grim refrain. Fuel was vanishing faster than it could be accounted for, and Germany's mechanized strength was grinding to a halt. In Berlin, the High Command met under the glare of crystal chandeliers and the oppressive weight of Hitler's gaze. The generals spoke in measured tones, masking panic with protocol. They debated minor adjustments, rationing for trucks, temporary halts for training exercises, but avoided the truth that lay beneath the numbers. Von Rundstedt, seated rigidly in his chair, felt every second of denial like a hammer against his skull. He had been through campaigns where luck and timing mattered, but this was different. The destruction of Ploiești was not a setback. It was a wound to the heart of Germany's war machine. Without fuel, even the most brilliant maneuvers were useless. Tanks would not roll, aircraft would not fly, supply lines would choke. Mechanized warfare, the very doctrine that had brought Germany its greatest victories, was on the brink of collapse. He stood abruptly, slamming his fist against the polished table. "We cannot continue like this." His voice cut through the murmurs. sharp as a whip. The room fell silent, eyes flicking nervously toward the field marshal. "Do you not understand? Half of our fuel is gone, half? How can we expect to fight on multiple fronts with the lifeblood of our armies drained?" Hitler's face remained impassive, the shadow of his cap hiding his eyes. "We have reserves, we will manage, adjustments can be made." Von Rundstedt exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, but inside, his anxiety coiled tighter. Adjustments, the word rang hollow. He could see the maps in his mind, armored divisions stalled miles from the front, Luftwaffe sorties grounded, supply convoys crawling along frozen roads, engines stuttering, soldiers waiting, morale eroding. Every command given without fuel was a command doomed to fail. The generals attempted to argue numbers tons of fuel available, shipments en route, but von Rundstedt knew better. Intelligence reports were never fully comprehensive in war. They were fragments, shadows of the truth. And the shadow looming over Germany was enormous, consuming, unstoppable dot in his quarters later. Von Rundstedt pored over the logistics reports. Graphs showing declining stockpiles, charts detailing fuel consumption, and intercepted communications revealing desperate pleas from frontline commanders. He traced each supply line, imagined every truck that would never reach its destination, and every tank left useless in the mud. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse of an empire, one crucial cog at a time. He recalled the pride of his early campaigns, the swift advances through France and Poland, the triumph of mechanized speed and strategy. Now that same pride, twisted into dread. Germany's strength lay not just in soldiers or weapons, but in mobility. And mobility depended entirely on fuel. Without it, even the best-trained units were paralyzed, and no amount of courage or skill could change that. Reality. The reports kept arriving. A panzer division had halted near Kursk. Luftwaffe squadrons over the Mediterranean could not launch sorties. Fuel depots in Poland were being rationed to the point of absurdity. Each note, each telegram, tightened the grip of anxiety on von Rundstedt's chest. He could see the domino effect, stalled offensives, supply shortages, disheartened troops. And, eventually, a broken front that could not be repaired. He summoned his closest aides, the room dark except for the flickering lamp over his desk. "We must plan for a reality they refuse to acknowledge," he said. "Our operational capability is not theoretical, it is dying. We cannot wait for hope or miracle deliveries. We must assume the worst and act accordingly." The aides nodded. Hesitantly, scribbling notes understanding the gravity but also the danger of voicing such truths in Berlin. Rumors of dissent could be fatal, but von Rundstedt's mind raced faster than caution. He had to see the consequences clearly if Germany was to survive another week of campaigns, yet as night fell over the city he knew there was little left to do. Each hour that passed without fuel shipments, each convoy intercepted by Allied forces, each bombed refinery added weight to an invisible scale, tipping Germany ever closer to strategic collapse. He stared at the ceiling, images of stalled tanks and grounded aircraft dancing behind his eyes. The Wehrmacht's momentum, the very thing that had seemed unstoppable, was slipping, and he alone could see the extent of the danger. Outside, the city continued its nightly rhythms unaware of, the silent, creeping paralysis spreading through the military. Inside, von Rundstedt sat in grim contemplation. The Ploiești fields were more than a refinery, they were a mirror, reflecting a painful truth that few wanted to admit. Germany's war machine, mighty as it appeared, had a vulnerability no strategy could cover if ignored. And for the first time, he feared not the enemy, but the collapse that would come from within. He whispered to himself, a shadow of fear threading his voice. "This war is no longer ours to win." The early dawn over the Carpathian Mountains was deceptively calm. From the cockpit of his B-24 Liberator, Major James E. Thompson squinted against the first rays of sunlight, the horizon painted with streaks of pink and gold. Below, the oil fields of Ploiești stretched out, a sprawling network of refineries, storage tanks and pipelines, the lifeblood of the German war machine. For months, the Allies had planned this raid with painstaking precision. Intelligence reports had mapped every refinery, every road, every anti-aircraft position. Operation Tidal Wave was to be a decisive strike, a blow aimed straight at the heart of Germany's mobility and power. Every bomber, every crew member knew the stakes. Some whispered prayers. Others stared at instruments with quiet determination. The roar of engines masked their collective fear. As the formation approached, the tension was palpable. Flak bursts erupted from the ground, tearing through the sky like jagged lightning. The pilots weaved and dove, narrowly avoiding trails of fire and exploding ordnance. Thompson's hands were steady on the controls, but his knuckles were white. "Steady, steady," he muttered under his breath. Around him, bombs were armed, released, and the Liberators' metal skins shuddered with each anti-aircraft hit. Below, the refineries were consumed by fire and smoke within minutes. Storage tanks ruptured in fiery explosions, pipelines were shredded, and machinery that had taken years to build twisted into molten wreckage. The sheer scale of destruction was staggering. It was not merely a tactical strike. It was a surgical annihilation of an entire industrial complex. From the ground, German defenders scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns fired relentlessly, but the Allies had calculated their approach meticulously, minimizing losses while maximizing damage. Smoke and fire climbed high into the sky, a dark beacon visible for miles. The screams of burning steel and collapsing structures filled the air, mingling with the distant hum of aircraft engines retreating to safer altitudes. Back in Berlin, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Von Rundstedt was summoned immediately. As he read the latest reports, the enormity of the destruction settled over him like a leaden weight. Half of Germany's oil production was gone. Storage tanks, refineries, pipelines obliterated. The calculations he had made over the past weeks now transformed from abstract numbers into a grim reality. He leaned over the desk, tracing lines of fuel consumption against frontline deployments. Every armored division that had been scheduled for offensive maneuvers would now be immobilized. Aircraft sorties planned over the Eastern Front could not launch. Supply convoys that had been the arteries of occupied Europe were effectively paralyzed. For the first time, he realized that the Wehrmacht's operational strength was not just challenged, it was fatally weakened. Von Rundstedt's mind raced. He imagined panzer divisions stalled in muddy fields, tanks abandoned with engines cold, and crews frustrated, supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Each logistical failure would cascade into another, units cut off, reinforcements delayed, morale plummeting. The Allies had not merely damaged Ploiești. They had struck a nerve that ran to the core of Germany's military power, he called his. Aides close, voice low but urgent. This is no longer a setback. This is the pivot point. Every offensive, every counterattack, every maneuver we have planned depends on mobility. And now that mobility is gone. Do you understand what this means? The room was silent. The aides nodded, but the weight of truth pressed heavily on every man present. Von Rundstedt's eyes scanned the maps once more, lingering on each front. Where fuel shortages would manifest in stalled tanks, grounded aircraft, and paralyzed logistics. The Allies' success was not just tactical, it was strategic. The war that had seemed winnable, achievable through speed and maneuver, was slipping beyond reach. He sank into his chair, a deep exhale escaping him. He had always understood the vulnerability of overextension, the fragility of supply lines, but now it was undeniable. Germany's war machine, celebrated for its precision and mobility, was crippled. And there was no immediate solution, no quick repairs, no rapid replacement of lost resources. Ploiești had been annihilated, and the Wehrmacht would feel the consequences for months, perhaps years. Outside, the smoke from the bombed refineries still rose in thick black columns visible from miles away. The Allies had struck at the source, and for von Rundstedt, the reality was chilling. This single raid, executed with courage and meticulous planning, had exposed a weakness that no strategy could fully overcome. He closed the folder, fingers drumming lightly against the desk. The room seemed to shrink around him, every shadow, a reminder of the coming struggles. The war, he realized with a cold certainty, was no longer about winning, it was about surviving the consequences of a single, devastating blow. And for Germany, survival was no longer guaranteed. The reports came faster than anyone could process. Stalled panzer divisions littered the Eastern Front like broken toys. Convoys that should have delivered ammunition and food crawled along frozen roads, engines sputtering, crews praying for fuel that would never arrive. The Wehrmacht's offensive momentum had ground to a halt, and with every hour, the echoes of failure spread further. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt studied the dispatches. With a tightening chest, letters from commanders, telegrams marked urgent, and reconnaissance reports all painted the same bleak picture. Germany's mechanized strength was unraveling. Tanks abandoned in the mud, Luftwaffe squadrons immobilized, supply depots empty. Each note was a nail in the coffin of the campaigns he had once believed unassailable. Berlin was in chaos. Hitler's command staff convened yet another meeting, the room thick with tension, smoke from cigars curling in the dim light. Hitler's voice rang out, precise, demanding, unyielding. "Advance, push forward. Do not let the enemy regroup." His orders were clipped. Confident but detached from the grim reality of stalled divisions and paralyzed supply lines, von Rundstedt rose from his chair, his voice calm but urgent. "Mein Führer, our forces cannot advance. Fuel reserves are critically low, tanks cannot move, aircraft cannot fly, and supply lines are collapsing. Any push now will be catastrophic." Hitler's eyes, hard and unyielding, met von Rundstedt's. "Excuses. We have fought under worse conditions. You must find a way. The enemy must not be allowed to breathe." The clash of strategy and political stubbornness filled the room. Von Rundstedt felt the familiar, suffocating weight of authority over reality. He had learned that in war, courage and loyalty often collided with the dangerous illusions of those who commanded from afar. "With all due respect," he said, voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut, "this is not a matter of bravery. It is logistics. Without fuel, we have no maneuverability, no tactical advantage. Any offensive now risks annihilation." But the generals surrounding him were hesitant, wary of contradicting Hitler. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and von Rundstedt felt frustration bubbling beneath his disciplined exterior. He had predicted this vulnerability, had anticipated that a single, precise strike against Ploiești could unravel operations. And now, the evidence was undeniable, yet the leadership clung to hope, denial, and rigid pride. He retreated to his quarters later that evening, the maps of Europe spread across the desk, lines and arrows tracing campaigns that now seemed fragile and temporary. He traced the halted movements of divisions, imagined the soldiers stranded in freezing fields, their engines cold, morale crumbling. His hands trembled slightly as he calculated supply shortfalls, reroutes, and emergency contingencies, but every scenario led to the same grim conclusion. Germany's war machine was unraveling, and nothing short of miracle could restore its momentum. At the front, the consequences were immediate and harrowing. Units expected to spearhead offensives retreated under pressure, not from enemy superiority, but from sheer incapacity. Commanders radioed frantic pleas for fuel, for reinforcements, for instructions, and often received only vague assurances or unrealistic directives. Convoys turned back, engines gave out, and soldiers froze in frustration and fear. The scale of the logistical nightmare was unprecedented. Von Rundstedt knew that morale was as fragile as tanks without fuel. Men trained to strike with speed now faced stagnation, and the confidence that had propelled victories in Poland and France evaporated. He walked along the lines of intelligence reports, envisioning the domino effect, stalled units causing gaps. In the front, communication breakdowns, disjointed responses to enemy movements. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of relentless efficiency, was losing cohesion by the hour. In Berlin, Hitler remained resolute, issuing orders that defied reality. Hold the line. Advance to the next objective. Yet each command clashed with the frozen truths on the ground. Von Rundstedt's warnings, rational and precise, were largely ignored, met with polite nods and thinly veiled frustration. The growing gulf between political determination and operational reality was widening dangerously. The night stretched long, shadows creeping across the maps and reports, mirroring the creeping despair in von Rundstedt's mind. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the dim light, and stared at the projected paths of supply lines now crippled by destruction and delay. The realization weighed heavier than any enemy shell. It was not the battlefield that threatened Germany now, but its inability to move, to sustain, to respond. The fear spread quietly, invisibly, but undeniably. It permeated staff offices, frontline units, and every strategic calculation. The war that had once seemed winnable, that had promised glory and domination, now teetered on the edge of collapse, not due to enemy brilliance alone, but because a single, precise blow at Ploiești had revealed the fragility of an empire built on mobility. Von Rundstedt leaned back in his chair, exhaustion and dread mingling in the lines of his face. He had served his country faithfully, commanded armies with skill and courage, but even he could not conjure fuel from the ruins or restore the lifeblood of a paralyzed military. He closed his eyes, imagining frozen tanks, stranded convoys, and the widening cracks in the Wehrmacht's operational capability. Outside, the city hummed with routine, oblivious to the quiet. Insidious collapse spreading across Europe. Inside, a man who had once trusted in strategy and precision felt a new, terrifying truth settle into his bones. Germany's war machine was no longer invincible, and the shadow of failure was closing in. Night had fallen over Berlin, but the city's lights felt distant, almost unreal, to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He sat alone in his office, the maps of Europe spread before him, bathed in the cold glow of a single desk lamp. The chaos of command meetings, the endless reports, the arguments with political leaders, they all faded into a hollow background. As he faced the undeniable truth, the destruction of Ploiești was not just a tactical loss. It was a wound that ran through the very arteries of the German military. Von Rundstedt traced his finger over the front lines on the map, imagining the panzer divisions that had once advanced with unstoppable speed. Each division now halted, immobilized by the lack of fuel. Engines idled in mud, artillery sat unused, and supply lines carefully calculated to maintain Germany's fighting force had fractured into chaos. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. In his mind he could see the Luftwaffe squadrons, grounded, unable to patrol, unable to strike. Reconnaissance missions that had once offered strategic clarity now faltered, leaving commanders blind to enemy movements. Reinforcements, troops that should have bolstered faltering fronts, were stranded in transit, their trains and trucks crawling with delays and detours. Each delay compounded the last, a chain reaction of paralysis that no ingenuity could fully overcome. His thoughts turned inward. He had spent a lifetime serving Germany, believing in discipline, strategy, and the strength of its armies. Loyalty was ingrained into every fiber of his being. Yet here, in the quiet of his office, stripped of political pretense and ceremonial formality, he confronted a harsh, unwelcome reality. Loyalty alone could not win a war that had already begun to slip beyond reach. He imagined the soldiers at the front, young men trained to strike with precision and courage, now trapped in a limbo of immobility. Each stalled tank, each grounded aircraft, each stranded convoy was a failure not of bravery, but of circumstance, of strategy rendered impotent by a single devastating blow. The realization twisted in his chest like ice. Victory was no longer possible, not with Germany's mechanized forces crippled and its resources stretched beyond endurance. Von Rundstedt reached for a pencil, marking potential fallback positions, recalculating routes and theorizing contingency plans. But every calculation led to the same conclusion. Germany's operational capability was critically diminished. Every offensive had to be postponed, every maneuver reconsidered, every expectation tempered by the reality of insufficient fuel. He paused, pencil hovering over the map, and felt the crushing weight of inevitability pressing down on him. He thought of Hitler's orders, the unyielding insistence on offensive operations, the refusal to acknowledge the reality of the front lines. He had tried to reconcile duty with truth, attempted to advise rationally, to anticipate outcomes that the political leadership refused to see. And yet, the stark fact remained. Germany's war machine was vulnerable in a way that could no longer be hidden, ignored, or patched. The office grew colder. Shadows stretching across the maps, creeping over the lines that represented lives, equipment, and hope. Von Rundstedt's hand trembled slightly as he set down the pencil. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the enormity of the loss. Not only the destruction of Ploiești, but the cascading consequences that would ripple across every front. The Wehrmacht's pride, its efficiency, its feared mobility, all were at risk of disintegration. A silence settled around him, deep and absolute. The strategies he had honed, the campaigns he had orchestrated, all now seemed fragile against a reality dictated by logistics and chance. Germany could no longer operate as a coherent force. Its strength was fractured, its momentum lost. He had spent decades preparing for moments of crisis, but this was beyond preparation. This was a systemic collapse, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Von Rundstedt closed his eyes and let himself confront the truth fully, without the veil of hope, without the comforting illusion that strategy alone could compensate. He had served with honor, commanded with skill, and yet here he was, a man who understood war more than most. Forced to acknowledge that the tide had turned irreversibly, he whispered to the empty office, a voice tinged with resignation and sorrow. It cannot be won, not now, not ever. The maps on the desk reflected the weight of the war's turning point. Every line and arrow a testament to the strategic reality he could no longer ignore. The Allied strike had done more than destroy refineries. It had exposed the fatal vulnerability of a nation, the fragile lifeblood of its military. And for von Rundstedt, alone with this truth, the stark inevitability settled deep within his bones. Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the calculation, reflection and despair unfolding in one of its war rooms. Inside, a man who had once believed in the invincibility of Germany's army sat quietly, eyes closed, facing the devastating clarity of history. The war would continue, but the path to victory had vanished in smoke and fire, leaving only the haunting question of how much more could be lost before the end. The winter winds howled across the eastern front, rattling the skeletal remains of supply convoys and frozen tanks. Von Rundstedt received word after word, each report more harrowing than the last. Divisions that had been poised for offensives now limped backward, retreating not under enemy fire but under the crushing weight of fuel shortages. Engines refused to turn, artillery remained silent, and soldiers trudged along icy roads, dragging what equipment they could salvage. Every front told the same story. In France, armored units stalled on narrow roads, unable to regroup. In Poland, transport trucks carrying ammunition and provisions were stranded, crews abandoned to the bitter cold. Even in Italy, Luftwaffe squadrons sat idle on the tarmac, unable to defend against increasingly aggressive Allied raids. The Wehrmacht's once feared coordination was dissolving into chaos, a patchwork of isolated units vulnerable to attack. Morale, always fragile at the front, cracked. Letters from field commanders described frustrated soldiers, their discipline slipping under the weight of helplessness. Units refused to follow orders that they knew were impossible to execute. The young men trained for rapid, decisive victories now wandered like ghosts among their immobilized vehicles. Hunger, cold, and fatigue gnawed at them, while the knowledge that they could accomplish nothing despite their courage burned deep. Berlin, meanwhile, was a storm of political tension. Hitler and his inner circle clashed with generals, their orders increasingly unrealistic, their impatience growing. Every failed offensive prompted frantic directives, yet the logistical impossibility was obvious to anyone with a shred of operational sense. Rumors of dissent and frustration circulated quietly in the corridors of power. Even loyal staffers whispered about the growing disparity between commands from Berlin and the grim realities on the front lines. Von Rundstedt worked tirelessly to salvage the situation. He drafted contingency plans, recalculated supply routes, and tried to coordinate with regional commanders to stabilize the fronts. But for every plan executed, another obstacle emerged: rail lines destroyed, roads impassable, fuel convoys intercepted or delayed. His hands moved feverishly over the maps, tracing alternate routes, seeking ways to stretch the remaining resources, but every solution felt temporary, inadequate. He walked through the lines of his intelligence reports, imagining the soldiers stranded in the mud, their breath rising in puffs of mist as they struggled to move tanks that would not start, artillery pieces that could not fire. Civilians near occupied areas were not spared. Towns dependent on German logistics faced shortages of food and fuel, while cities braced for the increasing proximity of advancing Allied forces. The human toll of strategic failure weighed heavily on him, a burden compounded by his intimate understanding of how events had spiraled out of control. The Allied air raids continued to exploit the vulnerability. Reconnaissance revealed crippled units and supply depots burning in isolated attacks, forcing commanders to divert what little fuel remained to defense rather than offensive operations. Each destruction, each setback amplified the sense of doom that von Rundstedt had foreseen. After the Ploiești bombing, Germany's strategic position was deteriorating faster than any report could fully convey. In meetings with subordinates, von Rundstedt's frustration was tempered by the weight of responsibility. "We are not powerless," he would insist, voice firm yet lined with exhaustion. "We must stabilize the lines where we can, conserve what resources remain, and prepare for contingencies." But the words rang hollow against the backdrop of systemic collapse. Soldiers stranded, weapons immobilized, and supply chains fragmented rendered even the most carefully considered plans tenuous at best. Reports of retreat reached Berlin like a slow-moving avalanche. Orders to hold positions were ignored, not from defiance but from sheer impossibility. Troops withdrew under pressure, but the retreats were haphazard, leaving gaps in defenses, exposing flanks, and forcing neighboring units to abandon positions in a domino effect. Von Rundstedt watched helplessly as the Wehrmacht's coordination, once its greatest strength, eroded under the relentless pressure of operational paralysis. And yet, he continued. He convened commanders, issued revised directives, and personally tracked fuel allocations. His mind worked constantly, assessing vulnerabilities and recalculating possibilities. But the weight of inevitability hung over every decision. Each adjustment felt like patching a crumbling wall. Temporary measures against an unstoppable tide. By evening he paused, staring out at the city lights below. The human cost of the crisis was palpable. Soldiers huddled in frozen fields, civilians scavenged for essentials, and entire regions felt the ripple effects of a single strategic loss. Ploiești had been more than an oil field. It had been the pulse of Germany's military life. And now the nation's arteries were clogged, its strength bleeding away. Von Rundstedt closed the maps, rubbing his face with his hands. Exhaustion, frustration, and sorrow intermingled in his expression. He had fought and planned for decades, but this slow unraveling was beyond even his capacity to control. The consequences of the bombing were no longer theoretical. They were unfolding in real time, stretching across every front, touching every soldier, and threatening every aspect of Germany's war effort. The night grew darker, the wind outside carrying whispers of inevitability. Germany was faltering. And for von Rundstedt, the burden of foresight, the knowledge that collapse was coming, and that little could prevent it, was a weight heavier than any he had carried in battle. The winter of 1943 had hardened into a merciless reality. Across Europe, Germany's strategic positions were crumbling under the silent weight of scarcity. Tanks sat abandoned in muddy fields, their engines cold. Artillery pieces gathered frost, unmanned and useless. Convoys carrying food, ammunition, and reinforcements were delayed or destroyed. The Wehrmacht, once celebrated for its speed and precision, now staggered under the consequences of a single, devastating loss. The destruction of Ploiești. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood alone in his office. The maps that had once guided triumph now spread like grave markers. He traced lines over territories lost, regions retaken by the Allies, and fronts faltering under logistical collapse. The numbers no longer felt like abstract reports, they were the weight of human lives. Soldiers immobilized, civilians suffering, cities weakened. He felt the pulse of defeat in every corridor of the Reich, every frozen battlefield, every silent engine. He thought back to the early days of his career, to the pride of orchestrating campaigns with precision, to the confidence of seeing orders executed flawlessly across vast distances. He had believed in discipline, in planning, in the ingenuity of command. And yet all of it, years of strategy, decades of service, was rendered fragile by a vulnerability no battlefield heroics could repair. One oil field, destroyed, had exposed the Achilles heel of an empire built on mobility and mechanized warfare. Von Rundstedt allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, a whisper of sorrow for the men he commanded, young soldiers who had trusted. In leadership and doctrine now faced immobilization, hunger, and despair. Entire cities dependent on German control faced shortages, uncertainty, and the threat of occupation. The human cost of a single strategic blow had been magnified across a continent. He considered the choices made in Berlin, the stubborn orders from above, the political blindness to the reality on the ground. Strategy without awareness of logistical limitations had doomed operations before they could begin. The lesson, clear and brutal, settled over him. Foresight, planning, and careful consideration of resources were as critical as bravery and skill on the battlefield. A deep, weary exhale escaped him. Germany could continue to fight, but every movement, every operation was now constrained by scarcity. Momentum was gone. Victory was no longer attainable. The war, once a path to glory and power, had become a grim march toward inevitable defeat. Von Rundstedt gazed out the window, over the quiet city bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. The echoes of destroyed refineries and immobilized divisions seemed distant yet hauntingly present, a reminder that even the most formidable armies could fall from a single point of weakness. The Ploiești oil fields had not just been a target, they had been the catalyst of collapse, the fulcrum upon which Germany's fate pivoted. He closed the maps gently, hands resting on the worn wood of his desk. The responsibility, the pride, and the sorrow weighed heavily on him. He had served his nation with honor, but now he faced a truth that no strategy or courage could alter. The tide had turned, and the Reich's defeat was written in the shadows of destroyed refineries and stranded divisions. As silence filled the office, Von Rundstedt reflected on the bitter lesson of war, that power is fragile, that logistics can decide victory or failure, and that foresight, however rare, is invaluable. The war would rage on, but for Germany, the path to triumph had ended with the fire and smoke rising from Ploiești, leaving behind only the stark reality of what happens when an empire ignores the vulnerabilities at its core.